June 4, 1942. The morning sky above the Pacific shimmered with a deceptive calm. Aboard the Japanese carrier Akagi, Lieutenant Joy Tominaga stared down at the bustling flight deck, still gripping the flight roster he had clenched during his bombing run over Midway. His hands trembled, not from fear but from the awareness of something unsaid, an unease beneath the discipline, beneath the routine. In his breast pocket, a half-written letter to his wife rustled with the ocean wind. Its final line read, "The Americans are nowhere to be found. Victory is certain, but that certainty was a mirage." Hundreds of miles away, American aircraft were already closing in, and in less than 12 minutes, the face of the Pacific War would be irrevocably changed. None of the men on those Japanese carriers could know how close they stood to disaster. The decks were a hive of motion. Bombs rolled, torpedoes were removed, replaced with 800-kilogram land attack ordnance. Fuel lines snaked like deadly veins. The Akagi's crew moved with practiced efficiency, but the rhythm was frantic, nervous. Deep in the hangar, aircraft mechanic Konama Harada barked orders. Sweat rolled off his brow as his team worked amid fuel vapors and unsecured munitions. They had done this drill hundreds of times, but never under such pressure, and never with the gnawing sense that they might be one step behind. Elsewhere on the seas, 3 American carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, cut silently through the waves. Yorktown was barely seaworthy, hastily patched after Coral Sea. It should have taken 3 months to repair. The Americans had done it in 72 hours. Pearl Harbor's welders had labored as the ship was already en route, patching wounds as the hull steamed forward. On paper, the Japanese had the advantage. They possessed more aircraft, more experience, more confidence. They had won every major naval engagement in the Pacific so far. But numbers do not fight wars alone. Admiral Nagumo, aboard the Akagi, commanded the most powerful carrier task force ever assembled. 4 carriers, nearly 250 aircraft, elite pilots fresh from victories in Pearl Harbor, Darwin, and the Indian Ocean. Their mission: finish the job by obliterating Midway and any remaining American carriers. But they didn't know American codebreakers had deciphered their battle plans. Admiral Chester Nimitz had read their intentions, knew their formations, and laid a deadly trap northeast of Midway. He named the rendezvous Point Luck. The Japanese didn't expect resistance. They believed Midway would fall like the others. Their intelligence, skewed by assumptions, missed key truths. That Yorktown was operational, that the Americans knew their target, and that US forces were lying in ambush. The Japanese believed in their invincibility. That belief would become their undoing. Below deck, ordnance crews labored under dim lighting and an atmosphere thick with fuel and urgency. Safety protocols were ignored. There simply wasn't time. On the Kaga, bombs and torpedoes were stacked dangerously close. Fuel hoses remained connected. The hangar had become a floating powder keg. They were preparing for a second strike on Midway. They did not know death was bearing down from the sky. By 10:20 a.m., the carriers were poised for a new attack, decks full, crews ready. But at that precise moment, above them in the blue, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown circled, searching, low on fuel, no clear visual. The Americans didn't know it yet, but they were minutes away from the most decisive strike in modern naval history. And in the next part, we will descend into those fateful 11 minutes, where chaos and fire would sweep across steel decks, and the illusion of Japanese dominance would be shattered forever. Stay with us. The dive bombers from the USS Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky, flew in tense silence. Low on fuel, off course, and uncertain of the enemy's position, McClusky faced a decision that would shape the course of the war. Below them, the vast Pacific stretched endlessly. Then, hope. McClusky spotted a lone Japanese destroyer speeding north. He made a fateful call: follow that ship. That instinct, born of training and desperation, led them straight to the heart of the enemy fleet. Meanwhile, on the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood over a sea of confusion. Scout planes had reported enemy ships to the east, then corrected themselves. First destroyers and cruisers, then 1, possibly 2 carriers. Nagumo hesitated. He had just ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed for a second land strike. The decks were chaos, aircraft halfway loaded, bombs mounted but not fused. Fuel lines draped across the hangar floors, it would take at least 45 minutes to reverse the changeover and prepare a coordinated ship attack strike. Still, Nagumo made a decision: recover the returning Midway strike force first. Standard protocol. The Midway attackers, damaged and low on fuel, needed to land. Losing them would cost Japan its most experienced pilots. At 8:30 a.m., he ordered recovery operations to begin. It was a decision made with logic. It would prove fatal. At 9:18 a.m., radar aboard the Soryu picked up low-flying aircraft. American torpedo bombers, slow, outdated, and alone, began their assault. 15 Devastators from Hornet's VT-8 squadron roared in at sea level, flying straight into a wall of Japanese Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. It was a massacre. All 15 planes were shot down. 29 of 30 airmen died. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in the sea as his comrades perished. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, the vaunted Zeros, had been drawn to sea level. Their focus was locked downward, guns trained on the waves. Above, unseen and undisturbed, McClusky's dive bombers began their attack runs. It was 10:22 a.m. From 14,000 feet, the Enterprise dive bombers pushed into their steep, deadly dives. Lieutenant Richard Best led his squadron directly toward the Akagi. What he saw stunned him. Flight decks packed with aircraft, fuel hoses, munitions. A single hit in the right spot could ignite hell. Best released his bomb. It struck the flight deck, pierced through, and detonated in the hangar among stacked torpedoes and fully fueled aircraft. Simultaneously, other squadrons dove on the Kaga and Soryu. On the Kaga, 4 bombs landed within 30 seconds. One blast destroyed the bridge, killing the captain and senior officers instantly. The rest tore through aircraft, detonating fuel and ordnance. On the Soryu, 3 bombs hit in a perfect line. Fires erupted as secondary explosions turned the hangar into a furnace. Within 9 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were mortally wounded. Flames reached hundreds of feet into the sky. Men ran in all directions, some on fire, some trying to rescue the wounded. Command chains disintegrated. The pride of the Japanese fleet was now a field of smoldering steel. Lieutenant Best circled once before heading back to the Enterprise, running low on oxygen and fuel. Below him, the Akagi burned. He could see men leaping into the water. The sea, moments ago calm and blue, was now blackened by smoke, choked with wreckage. And yet the battle was not over. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, remained intact. Admiral Yamaguchi, its commanding officer, saw the burning pillars on the horizon and made a chilling decision: counterattack immediately. He would strike back with everything he had left. In Part 3, we follow the Hiryu's desperate attempt to salvage the unthinkable loss. What happens next will test the resolve of both navies and reveal just how much could still be lost. Aboard the Japanese carrier Hiryu, the last of the 4 giants still untouched, Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood firm. Smoke from the burning Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu rose like gravestones behind him. His face remained calm, but his eyes betrayed the weight of what he knew. The pride of the Imperial Navy had been gutted in under 15 minutes. But Yamaguchi was not a man to retreat. With a steel edge to his voice, he issued a command: launch all remaining aircraft. The counterstrike would go forward. At 10:58 a.m., Hiryu's deck crews sprang into action. 18 Valdive bombers and 6 Zero fighters roared into the sky. Among them was a familiar face, Lieutenant Yoichi Tomonaga, who had already led the morning strike on Midway. His plane had been damaged. His fuel tank was leaking. He knew he wouldn't have enough fuel to return, but he launched anyway. By noon, the Japanese strike group found the Yorktown. The American carrier, still recovering from its earlier assault, was vulnerable, but this time the defenses were ready. Radar had given early warning. Wildcats from the Combat Air Patrol scrambled into the sky. The battle that unfolded was fierce, close, and deadly. Despite the resistance, 3 bombs struck Yorktown. Fires spread quickly. The carrier lost power and slowed, listing to port. On board, crewmen fought back with desperation. Fire crews flooded compartments, sealed off damaged areas, and battled back the smoke and flames. Within an hour, they had stabilized her. The fires were out. Power had been partially restored. Yorktown wasn't finished, not yet, But Admiral Yamaguchi wasn't finished either. At 1:31 p.m., he launched a second strike, this time 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 more Zero escorts. Tominaga, wounded but undeterred, led the group. As they approached Yorktown at 2:42 p.m., anti-aircraft guns opened up. The sky was filled with tracers and flak bursts. Zeros darted through the chaos, clearing paths. The Japanese torpedo bombers lined up their attack runs. 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's port side. The ship shuddered. The force of the explosion lifted her out of the water. One destroyer escorting her, the USS Hammond, was struck by a secondary torpedo and broke apart. Within minutes, Yorktown began to list severely. She lost all power. Still, she did not sink. Back on the Hiryu, Yamaguchi received the report. His strike had hit home. He believed they had sunk 2 American carriers, unaware that they had attacked the same ship twice. With fuel and ordnance running low, Yamaguchi considered his options. He had no illusions. He knew the Americans would strike back. But he would not run. And they did. At 5:03 p.m., American dive bombers from Enterprise and the battered Yorktown found Hiryu. With precise timing and flawless execution, 4 bombs tore through her decks. One bomb detonated among fueled aircraft. Another ignited munitions. Fire spread unchecked. The vessel quickly sustained significant damage and was no longer operational. The captain, understanding the situation, gave the order for the crew to move to safety. A senior officer gathered his team to share a final message of encouragement, expressing confidence that they would regroup and rebuild for the future. He remained with the vessel as a testament to his dedication. By the end of the day, the fleet's main vessels were unable to continue their mission. The day's initial expectations shifted dramatically, leading to a very different outcome. The event resulted in the loss of many experienced crew members. A formidable naval group, once a leading force, was fundamentally changed by these events, and the full impact of these developments was still unfolding. In Part 4, we join the leadership team as they begin to understand the full scope of the recent event. A strategic plan, built on ingenuity, courage, and careful assessment, had brought about a significant change. On the main vessel, the atmosphere was serious and composed. The team remained focused on the tasks ahead. The Admiral stood on the bridge, looking toward the horizon, listening intently as operational updates arrived. The distant signs on the horizon indicated where the other vessels had previously been. His staff monitored the resource levels of the returning units, received updates on the team's condition, and awaited news on the status of the Yorktown. A successful outcome was still being determined, as is often the case in complex situations. Hours earlier, the commander made a pivotal decision: to launch the mission from a great distance without waiting for a coordinated effort. The undertaking was ambitious, and many of the planes had just enough fuel for the return journey. The commander's strategy was based on precise timing, and it proved to be a great success. As night fell, the crew began to understand the scale of their achievement. Reconnaissance reports confirmed the incredible news. 4 of the opposing fleet's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, had been put out of commission. It was a remarkable outcome for a single day's operation. However, the status of their own vessel, the Yorktown, was still uncertain. Damaged first by bombs, then struck by torpedoes, she now lay motionless, listing hard to port. Destroyers circled her like anxious sentries. The crew had been evacuated, but hopes remained that she might be towed and saved. Salvage teams began working around the clock to stabilize her. In Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz received the telegrams with a mix of relief and disbelief. The Japanese fleet, thought to be invincible, had been lured into a trap and broken apart. American codebreakers had been right. Every strategic move, every hunch, had been validated. The risk of placing understrength carriers in the path of a superior force had turned into one of the greatest gambles in naval history, and it had worked. But the cost weighed heavily. Reports of entire torpedo bomber squadrons lost, many without scoring a single hit, haunted the mission logs. Families would be notified, letters home would be left unsent. On the flight decks of the Enterprise and Hornet, empty spots marked where young men had once stood. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of VT-8, floated alone in the Pacific for hours. Watching Japanese ships burn, clutching a seat cushion to stay afloat. Back on Midway Island, the battered airfields bore witness to the ferocity of the initial Japanese strikes. The defenders had held, barely. Obsolete fighters and radar warnings had bought just enough time. The island's survival had cost dearly, but it had also served as the bait that lured the Japanese into range. The Japanese Navy, once the apex predator of the Pacific, now found itself shattered. Admiral Yamamoto, hundreds of miles away aboard the battleship Yamato, received the reports in stony silence: 4 carriers gone, thousands of trained crewmen lost. He turned to his staff and whispered, "The war is over. We will fight on, but the war is over." In the next chapter, Part 5, we follow the final act in this turning point, how the Japanese struggled to conceal their devastating loss, and how the Americans, still reeling from Pearl Harbor, began to believe that victory was not just possible, but inevitable. The morning of June 5th dawned with a thick haze of smoke still hanging over the Pacific. Fires still burned aboard the Japanese carriers, smoldering hulks that just a day before had embodied the might of the Imperial Navy. What hadn't already been consumed by flames now began to slip beneath the waves. The sea was littered with debris, oil slicks, and lifeless bodies, while destroyers circled frantically, plucking survivors from the water. But some men didn't want to be saved. Japanese sailors, gripped by duty and shame, refused the rescue lines. They shouted their final farewells, "May the Emperor live 10,000 years," and vanished beneath the surface, choosing death over survival. For them, defeat was dishonor, and the fall of the carriers marked the fall of everything they believed in. Far above, American patrol planes circled the ruins. The evidence was irrefutable. The Japanese fleet had been broken. The once invincible Kido Butai was no more. 3 carriers were confirmed sunk: Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Akagi still burned, but she would not last. By morning, she too would be scuttled by her own escort to prevent capture. Meanwhile, Yorktown, a symbol of American resilience, remained afloat, barely. The crew had returned to the crippled ship to assess the damage. Pumps were working, and a destroyer had managed to lash up for a tow. Hope flickered, but Japanese submarines, still lurking in the area, had not finished their hunt. At 1:30 p.m., the submarine I-168 slipped through the American screen. Her periscope locked onto the Yorktown and her escort, USS Hammond. 4 torpedoes launched. 2 struck Yorktown again, dooming her to the deep. 1 hit Hammond directly. She broke in 2 and sank in minutes. The sea was once again red with oil, fire, and men. When the final tally came, the numbers were staggering. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, over 300 aircraft, and more than 2,000 men, many of them irreplaceable veterans. The United States had lost 1 carrier and 307 men. It was a brutal cost, but the comparison left no doubt. Midway had been a strategic slaughter, but what followed was perhaps just as significant as the battle itself: silence. The Japanese High Command, humiliated and in disbelief, moved to cover up the defeat. Survivors were quarantined, families were told nothing. Official announcements spoke of success. But the truth seeped into the cracks. Morale plummeted. Officers whispered behind closed doors. The invincible image of the Imperial Navy had been shattered. In Washington, news of the victory lifted a nation still haunted by the memory of Pearl Harbor. Midway had proven something vital. America could fight back, and more than that, it could win. Publicly, details were sparse to protect intelligence sources, but within military circles, Midway became legend. The codebreakers at Station HIIPO, the welders who repaired Yorktown in 72 hours, the pilots who flew into suicide missions, they were the quiet architects of a miracle. And yet, even in victory, the Americans understood what had been sacrificed. Whole squadrons had vanished. Brave men had given their lives so that others could strike the fatal blow. On the flight decks, pilots wrote letters to families who would never know what those last hours were like. In Part 6, the story returns to the wreckage itself. We explore the final moments aboard Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the chaos, the courage, and the commanders who chose to die with their ships. What they left behind were not just burning vessels, but warnings written in fire for all who would fight the next war. June 4th had ended in fire. June 5th brought only silence. By early morning, the last of the Japanese carriers, Akagi, still floated. But just barely. Her steel frame groaned under the weight of the fire that had eaten through her decks all night. The sun rose over a sea blanketed in oil and smoke. What had been the most powerful naval strike force in history now lay broken across the Pacific. Aboard Akagi, the once bustling corridors were empty, dark and thick with smoke. Fires had gutted the hangar deck, igniting fuel lines and detonating stored munitions. Every explosion sent steel splinters whistling through the narrow passageways. Men had tried to fight back the flames, but the heat forced them to retreat. Now they waited for orders that wouldn't come. Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge, surrounded by silence. The command center had been stripped of purpose. Radio equipment was dead, communications gone. His flagship was no longer a weapon, just a funeral pyre drifting in the current. Captain Taijiro Aoki finally approached him and said the words Nagumo could not. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag. The ship is lost." Nagumo gave a slow nod, but even as he escaped Akagi, he left part of himself behind. He would survive the battle, but never recover. The decisions he made, when to rearm, when to launch, when to delay, would haunt him until the end of his days. He had followed doctrine, but doctrine had failed him. On the Kaga, the inferno was worse. She had been hit by 4 bombs, each one striking a nerve center. Her hangars were stacked with fully fueled planes and loose torpedoes. Fire raced through the ship like a living thing. The bridge had been destroyed instantly, the captain and senior staff killed in a flash. Below decks, hundreds were trapped. The heat was so intense that metal bulkheads glowed red. Doors couldn't be opened. Air ran out. The crew died in place, victims of steam, smoke, and flame. Soryu's end came swiftly. Her design, which carried fuel tanks along the sides of the hangar deck to extend range, became her downfall. When 3 bombs hit in a perfect line down the deck, the fuel tanks ruptured and erupted. The resulting firestorm reached temperatures over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Within minutes, the hangar became an open furnace. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto, still alive on the bridge, refused to leave. "Save yourselves," he ordered. "I will remain with Soryu." He lashed himself to the wheel and went down with his ship. Hiryu, the last to fall, clung to life longer than her sisters. After launching 2 brave counterattacks that crippled Yorktown, she was struck by American dive bombers just before sunset. Flames engulfed her decks. Captain Tomeo Kaku, mortally wounded, ordered the crew to abandon ship. But Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, who had led the last strike with valor and fury, made his choice. He would not leave. "I will apologize to the Emperor," he said. His officers begged him to go. He declined. As the flames grew brighter, Yamaguchi saluted his men one final time and stepped into history. By dawn on June 6th, 3 carriers had already sunk. Akagi and Hiryu were scuttled shortly after, their hulls too damaged to save. The Pacific swallowed them whole, leaving behind oil-streaked trails and the occasional piece of wreckage. The Japanese Navy had lost more than steel. They had lost the men who made those ships lethal, the veteran pilots, the skilled mechanics, the deck handlers who kept aircraft flying through endless hours. In Part 7, we'll uncover the ripple effect of these losses. Why Japan, despite building more carriers, could never again replace what was lost. And how the American system, industrial, tactical, and technological, had begun to win the war before anyone fully understood it. As the fires of Midway cooled and the sea reclaimed its dead, the deeper impact of Japan's defeat began to unfold, not on the ocean, but in the factories, training fields, and mines of both nations. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost more than 4 fleet carriers. It had lost time, it had lost experience, and it had lost something that could never be rebuilt: momentum. In Tokyo, military leaders struggled to comprehend the scale of the disaster. They knew the numbers: 4 carriers, over 300 aircraft, and more than 2,000 men gone. But they hadn't yet grasped the strategic chasm that had opened. These weren't just any carriers. They were the Kido Butai, the tip of Japan's spear, the same fleet that had bombed Pearl Harbor, swept through the Indian Ocean, and terrified the Pacific. And now they were gone. Back in Pearl Harbor, the United States was already looking forward. The Navy's shipyards were operating around the clock. New carriers were already under construction. 17 would be launched within the next 2 years. Pilot training programs were expanding at an industrial scale. By 1943, the United States would be producing 10,000 naval aviators every month. Japan, by contrast, could barely train 500. And it wasn't just pilots, the loss of experienced ground crews, the men who knew how to mount torpedoes in the dark, who could fuel and launch fighters in under 5 minutes, who understood every sound of an engine, was a crippling blow. These weren't men who could be replaced in weeks. They took years to train. Japan had no reserves of such skill. Their replacements would be younger, greener, and less prepared for the brutal pace of war. In the aftermath of Midway, the Japanese Navy began implementing changes. Combat air patrols would now be retained at higher altitude. Ordnance would be returned to magazines immediately, not left exposed on deck. Radio silence would be loosened to allow better tactical coordination. But all of these changes came too late and treated the symptoms, not the cause. Because at its heart, Midway hadn't just been a tactical failure, it had been a systemic one. Japan had bet on boldness, experience, and initiative. The United States had bet on code-breaking, radar, production, and coordination. One was the doctrine of the warrior, the other the doctrine of the system. And at Midway, the system had won. American commanders understood this, even if they didn't say it out loud. They had seen what worked. The codebreakers at Station Hypo had cracked the JN-25 code. The intelligence teams had predicted Japan's every move. The hasty repair of the Yorktown in just 3 days, an act of impossible speed, had turned the tide. Every one of these elements had demanded a system capable of adapting faster than any single mind. For the Japanese, the reckoning would come slowly. The defeat at Midway was so severe that the Imperial Navy kept it secret. Survivors were quarantined, officers sworn to silence. Propaganda painted a different picture, but the truth leaked out in whispers, and with it, confidence within the fleet began to erode. They would fight on, yes, but not with the same certainty. In Part 8, we turn to the other side of the Pacific. The American pilots who had delivered the killing blows now returned home as heroes, but also as haunted men. What was victory, they wondered, when it came at the cost of so many lives? Their reflections would shape not just the memory of Midway, but the meaning of war itself. For the American airmen who returned from Midway, triumph was inseparable from trauma. The mission had been a success beyond imagining. 4 enemy carriers destroyed in a single day. But the human cost lingered in every quiet moment afterward. On the flight decks of the Enterprise, Hornet, and the now doomed Yorktown, men gathered in silence where their squadron mates should have stood. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose bomb had detonated deep inside the Akagi, was hailed as a hero. His precision strike had triggered a chain reaction that turned a flagship into a funeral pyre. Yet for Best, the victory carried an invisible weight. During the dive, he had breathed caustic fumes from a damaged oxygen system. The exposure would later activate a latent case of tuberculosis, ending his flying career. He would spend the rest of his life haunted not by what he failed to do, but by the perfection of what he had done. "I did my duty," Best would say in a rare interview decades later. "But duty doesn't erase the knowledge that my success meant hundreds of other men died doing theirs." Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, drifted alone in the ocean for over 30 hours, watching the battle unfold from the water. Hidden under a seat cushion, he saw the Akagi burn, saw men leap from flaming decks, heard the final explosions echo across the sea. He was rescued days later, physically intact, but psychologically changed. "I watched them burn," he said, "and I knew I was alive because they had died." The returning pilots found that the public hailed them, but few understood the true nature of what had occurred. Newspapers spoke of glory, valor, and turning points, but for the men who had flown through clouds of flak and into swarms of zeros, the memories were seared in fragments. The smell of burning rubber, the sound of wounded engines, the sudden silence of a plane disappearing into the sea. Letters were written to families back home. Some never reached their destinations. Others were returned, marked with a cold stamp, deceased. Survivors visited the homes of fallen comrades. meeting mothers, wives, and siblings who looked into their eyes and asked questions no one could answer. Why did my son die? Could he have been saved? Did he suffer? The United States Navy awarded medals, held ceremonies, and raised flags. But the young men who had flown at Midway rarely spoke of it. Some returned to the skies for later battles. Others left the service altogether, unable to fly again. Still others carried the guilt quietly, smiling in photographs, standing tall during interviews, and waking at night to the sound of memories they couldn't silence. Midway had changed them. It had changed the nation. No longer were American sailors and pilots simply survivors of Pearl Harbor. Now they were aggressors, strategic thinkers, skilled fighters, and instruments of a growing force that would soon stretch across the Pacific. But even with the tide turning, every man who came back from Midway knew it had been balanced on a knife's edge. A wrong turn, a late launch, a cloud bank out of place, and the outcome could have been reversed. In Part 9, we return to the intelligence war behind the battle, the hidden hands who decoded Japanese messages, predicted movements, and positioned American carriers for ambush. These unsung heroes never touched the controls of an aircraft, but their quiet brilliance made the impossible possible. Long before the bombs fell and the ocean burned, the Battle of Midway had already begun, in the shadows, in codebooks, and in a basement beneath Pearl Harbor. There, behind locked doors, a small team of American cryptanalysts at Station Hypo worked around the clock to break Japan's most closely guarded naval communication system, the JN-25 code. At the center of this quiet war was Commander Joseph Rochefort. Unassuming, sharp, and obsessive, Rochefort lived among message intercepts and frequency charts. He wore a bathrobe to work, rarely left the basement, and drove his team relentlessly. His analysts were linguists, mathematicians, and engineers. Together, they formed a unit that Japan didn't even know existed. By mid-May 1942, Rochefort's team had begun to suspect that a major Japanese operation was underway. Intercepts referred repeatedly to a mysterious target, AF. The Japanese had used similar two-letter designations for past attacks, and Rochefort became convinced that AF was Midway. But in Washington, Navy intelligence wasn't sure. Some believed AF might be Fiji. Others guessed the Aleutians. To confirm their suspicion, Rochefort and his deputy, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, devised a simple deception. Midway sent an unencrypted message, deliberately exposed, saying that its freshwater condenser had failed. Within hours, Japanese transmissions reported that AF was low on water. The trap had worked. The target was confirmed, decisive. With this knowledge, Admiral Chester Nimitz made a fateful decision. He would not defend Midway conventionally. Instead, he would set an ambush. He ordered 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, to take position northeast of the atoll, at a point codenamed Point Luck. He would wait there, out of sight, for the enemy to walk into his guns. But Rochefort's work didn't stop there. Every day, new messages poured in. His team tracked the positions of Japanese carriers, the timing of their launches, the composition of their fleet. It was intelligence on a scale never before achieved in the Pacific. The Japanese, confident in their codes, transmitted everything in clear detail, and the Americans read it all. The brilliance of the codebreakers wasn't just in their technical skill, it was in their understanding of human behavior. They knew how Japanese commanders thought. They could predict how they would maneuver, where they would place scouts, and when they would strike. They knew, for example, that the Japanese would send out scout planes too late and with too few resources. They predicted accurately that a delayed scout from the cruiser Tone would miss the American fleet until it was too late. Without Rochefort and his team, Midway would have been another slaughter, another Coral Sea, another Pearl Harbor. Instead, it became a defining moment of the war. Yet, ironically, Rochefort would not be rewarded. Political rivalries in Washington led to his reassignment. He was pulled from intelligence work, sent to manage a dry dock in San Francisco. It would be decades before his contributions were publicly acknowledged. But his legacy was imprinted on the outcome of the battle. Every bomb that struck a Japanese carrier had Rochefort's fingerprints on it. Every dive bomber that launched into empty blue sky did so with knowledge no pilot could see, but everyone depended on. In Part 10, we explore what Midway taught the world about modern naval warfare, the strategic, technological, and doctrinal lessons that would redefine how aircraft carriers were built, defended, and fought in every ocean to come. In the wake of Midway, the world's navies found themselves staring into a new reality. For centuries, maritime strategy centered on large vessels showcasing their strength from a distance. Ships with impressive cannons and robust designs were considered the most influential on the seas. However, a pivotal event in history introduced a new perspective. The era of the aircraft-launching vessel had truly begun, bringing with it a new understanding of naval operations. This moment proved a decisive truth. In modern maritime activities, the most effective asset is not a ship's direct power, but its ability to launch aircraft. A vessel's most impactful moment became when it turned into the wind, prepared its planes, and projected its influence across the sky. But it also revealed a carrier's most vulnerable moment, the precise window when it was rearming, refueling, and recovering its aircraft. The Japanese carriers at Midway were caught in this vulnerable window. Flight decks were crowded, fuel lines were draped across hangars, bombs and torpedoes were being switched mid-operation. In those critical minutes, they were defenseless, paralyzed between strikes. American dive bombers struck at exactly that moment. The result was catastrophe. This revelation reshaped naval doctrine overnight. Deck load strikes, keeping planes ready to launch on the flight deck rather than storing them below, became standard. Combat air patrols were layered at multiple altitudes, not just sea level, ensuring no attack could go unnoticed. Hangar decks were cleared of ordnance unless absolutely necessary. Damage control, long considered secondary, was elevated to a central pillar of carrier design and training. The performance of American ships under fire also underscored another critical difference. Preparation. The USS Yorktown had already survived Coral Sea. Her crew knew how to fight fires, isolate damage, and keep a wounded ship afloat. Even after suffering 3 bomb hits, her sailors rallied, restored power, and prepared for more. Meanwhile, Japanese carriers, designed for offensive operations and speed, lacked effective damage control systems. When hit, their fires spread unchecked. Their design emphasized attack, not survival. Technology also proved decisive. American radar systems provided early warning of incoming raids, allowing fighters to scramble in time. Communications, while imperfect, were sufficient to coordinate multiple carrier groups and adjust strategy in real time. In contrast, the Japanese relied on visual spotting and strict radio silence. When things went wrong, they couldn't adapt fast enough. Perhaps most importantly, Midway exposed the consequences of overconfidence. Japan had operated for 6 months as if its forces were untouchable. Its pilots were the best trained in the world, its ships the most lethal. Its victories had come fast and often. But they hadn't faced a determined, informed enemy with nothing to lose. Midway was a reminder that no advantage is permanent. Hubris, left unchecked, becomes a weakness. Naval planners around the world took notes. In Washington and London, in Berlin and Tokyo, Midway became required study. It wasn't just a battle, it was a transformation, a demonstration of how a few minutes of precise action could overturn years of planning and strategy. In Part 11, we descend to the ocean floor, where the twisted wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu now lie in silence. Recent discoveries have unearthed not just steel remnants, but haunting reminders of the lives that vanished in those 11 minutes, and the future they altered forever. Beneath the surface of the Pacific, thousands of feet below the waves, lie the rusting remains of a battle that changed history. In total darkness and crushing pressure, the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rest in silence. Time has taken their shine, but not their story. They are not just wreckage, they are monuments, graves for men, symbols of transformation, and silent teachers of war's true cost. For decades, their exact locations were unknown. The ocean had swallowed them, their fates sealed in watery shadows. But in recent years, deep-sea exploration teams, using advanced sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and submersibles, finally found them. In 2019 and again in 2023, explorers mapped the wrecks in extraordinary detail. The Akagi rests 17,000 feet below sea level. Broken, but unmistakable, her flight deck lies partially intact, still recognizable. A jagged hole marks the point where Richard Best's bomb tore through her skin and set off a chain of explosions. Around her, pieces of aircraft, fuel tanks, and shattered tools are scattered like forgotten artifacts of chaos. No human remains were found, but the ship feels human, its silence heavy with memory. Kaga lies nearby, its massive hull crumpled from internal blasts. Dive bombers had ripped her open, igniting stored munitions, and fell. The explosion that consumed her bridge left twisted metal beams in impossible shapes. Engineers who reviewed the wreckage noted that her internal bulkheads were thinner than expected. Another vulnerability that sealed her fate when fire raced unchecked below deck. The Soryu, lost the fastest of all, lies in pieces. One section of her hull is folded inward, showing the ferocity of the heat and pressure that collapsed her from within. What struck observers most wasn't the damage, but what was left untouched. Helm wheels still in place, a control panel covered in rust but preserved. The final order given from that bridge was to abandon ship, but her captain never left. Ryusaku Yanagimoto's last command still echoes through the metal. Hiryu's wreck lies farther from the others, alone as she was in her final hours. She fought until the end, launching both of Japan's counterattacks, and her position reflects that. Her deck is torn, her hangars blackened. Explorers found evidence of scuttling charges, Japanese sailors doing everything they could to prevent capture. Her destruction was not sudden. It was slow, painful, and deliberate. Each of these wrecks now falls within the protected boundaries of the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument. No longer instruments of war, they are treated as sacred sites. Wreaths have been dropped above them, ceremonies held. Survivors, American and Japanese, have wept above those waters, not as enemies, but as men who once shared a moment that neither side could forget. From the ocean floor, Midway's story speaks in a different voice. The rust and the silence tell us what textbooks can't, that war is not just movement of armies or clash of ideologies, it's steel twisted by fire. It's young lives lost in seconds, it's decisions made in minutes that change the world for generations. In Part 12, we move beyond the wrecks and into the halls of strategy and industry. How did America turn Midway's victory into unstoppable momentum? How did Japan fail to recover? We explore the systems that shaped the second half of the Pacific War and sealed the fate of two empires. In the months following Midway, the tide of war shifted, not just in the ocean, but in the factories, training schools, and war rooms that powered the arsenals of nations. The battle had shown what courage and timing could achieve, but it was industry, planning, and logistics that would determine who would win the long war. In the United States, the victory at Midway lit a fire across the homeland. War bonds soared, factories converted to military production with unprecedented speed. Shipyards expanded, building carriers, destroyers, and escort ships faster than anyone thought possible. New Essex-class aircraft carriers were being laid down before the smoke over Midway had even cleared. By 1943, America would launch more carriers than Japan had built in its entire history. Pilot training followed suit. Naval aviation schools began operating around the clock. Simulators, textbooks, and flight instructors became as valuable as munitions. From 1942 to 1945, America trained more than 60,000 naval aviators. Japan, in contrast, could barely replace what it had lost at Midway. Its training programs remained small, inflexible, and rooted in elitism. Only the best became pilots, but when the best were lost, there was no second wave. Strategically, the United States adopted a doctrine of aggressive advancement. Midway proved that the Japanese could be beaten. Now it was time to push forward. The island-hopping campaign began, targeting strategic locations across the Pacific. Each step brought American forces closer to Japan. Each island captured a staging ground for the next assault. Midway had been the turning point, not just tactically, but psychologically. Japan, meanwhile, struggled with denial and delay. The full scope of the Midway disaster was hidden from the Japanese public. Survivors were ordered into silence. Newspapers spoke of a tactical withdrawal, of damage inflicted on the enemy. But inside Naval Command, the truth was inescapable. The best ships were gone. The best pilots were dead. The war had become a race, and Japan was running out of breath. The Japanese shipbuilding industry could not compete. While American assembly lines launched carriers in months, Japan took years to produce a single fleet carrier. They began rushing the design and construction of replacements, but with limited resources and increasing Allied pressure, these ships often lacked the quality and survivability of their predecessors. Technical shortcuts and a shortage of skilled labor hampered every launch. Worse still, Japan had underestimated the importance of infrastructure. Their forward bases lacked proper repair facilities. Fuel supply lines stretched thin. Replacement aircraft were flown in piecemeal, often without spare parts. In contrast, America had turned the Pacific into a vast network of floating cities. Repair ships, mobile dry docks, hospital ships and resupply vessels followed every task force. All of this stemmed from a fundamental difference. Japan had built its strategy around decisive victories, shocking blows like Pearl Harbor or the sinking of the Royal Navy's battleships. But America, learning quickly, began waging a different kind of war. One of attrition and endurance, of systems over heroes. Midway had proven that boldness alone was not enough. It was a lesson Japan would relearn, painfully, in every battle that followed, from the Solomon Islands to the Philippine Sea. By war's end, the Imperial Navy would be a shadow of its former self, while American carrier task forces would dominate from horizon to horizon. In Part 13, we return to the human cost. What did Midway mean to the families left behind? To the widows who never received a body, to the children who grew up without fathers, and to the survivors who could never quite leave the battle behind. Long after the final bomb fell and the ocean swallowed the wreckage, Midway lived on in silence, in the homes of the fallen, in the quiet of empty dinner tables, and in the eyes of the men who came back. For thousands of families across Japan and America, the battle wasn't just a victory or a defeat. It was a fracture, a sudden absence that never fully healed. In Japan, official word of the disaster was slow and incomplete. Families received vague telegrams, missing in action, presumed lost at sea, no details, no graves. The military suppressed the truth to preserve morale. But the silence spoke volumes. Wives waited for news that never came. Mothers placed food at empty seats during meals. Children asked when their fathers would come home, and no one knew what to say. Aboard those 4 Japanese carriers had been more than just elite pilots. There were mechanics who knew how to tune engines by ear, armorers who could load a plane blindfolded, deck crews who directed aircraft with a flick of the wrist and a shout above roaring propellers, men who had built a war machine by hand and died in the heart of it. For the Americans, the grief came with headlines. Newspapers hailed the triumph, but also listed the names of the dead. Entire squadrons, like Torpedo 8 from the Hornet, had been wiped out. In small towns across the Midwest, mothers received letters written by their sons just before the battle, filled with hope and casual confidence. Days later, a Navy officer in dress uniform would arrive with the official notice. Ensign George Gay, who survived the annihilation of Torpedo 8, became a reluctant symbol of sacrifice. He toured the country, spoke at rallies, appeared in uniform on recruiting posters. But when the crowds were gone, he returned to silence. He often said he felt like he had died with his squadron, and in many ways he had. Lieutenant Richard Best, whose precision bombing helped sink the Akagi, never flew again. His lung disease from inhaled fumes left him hospitalized for years. He lived with the knowledge that his split-second decision, choosing which carrier to dive on, had changed history. He also lived with the weight of what that bomb had done. "I destroyed a ship, yes," he once said, "but I also destroyed the lives inside it." Survivors from both sides bore different but equally heavy burdens. Japanese sailors who escaped the burning carriers were often haunted by shame. In their culture, survival in the face of failure was dishonor. Many never spoke of the battle again. Some later took their own lives. Others lived quietly, always carrying a sense that they had abandoned their brothers. In the decades that followed, memorials were built. Names etched in stone, flags folded. But the true legacy of Midway rested not in monuments, but in memory. in the dreams of men who saw the sky turn black with flak, in the quiet moments when they remembered the faces of friends who didn't come home. As time passed, former enemies met at reunions, on ships turned museums, or at ceremonies held over the Pacific waters. They shook hands, they shared stories. They wept, not for sides, not for victory or loss, but for the dead who deserved to be remembered. In Part 14, we bring you into the final moments of the battle's aftermath, the reflections of those who led, those who followed, and those who stood in the quiet ruins of Midway and realized that the world had changed in less than 12 minutes. June 7, 1942. The last carrier lost at Midway, the USS Yorktown, slipped beneath the surface of the Pacific. She had fought with everything left in her steel and crew, absorbing more damage than any ship should have survived. As she went down, sailors aboard nearby destroyers stood in silence, saluting. She was more than a ship. She was the last visible cost of victory. At Pearl Harbor, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the final dispatches from Midway with quiet resolve. The numbers were sobering. 1 American carrier gone, dozens of aircraft lost, hundreds of lives sacrificed. And yet, what had been gained was far greater than any casualty report could measure. The Japanese carrier force, once seen as an unstoppable tide, had been broken. Nimitz understood what most others did not yet fully see, that Midway was not just a win, but a shift in gravity. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy had seized the initiative. The Pacific, once dominated by the Red Sun flag, was now contested. Every mile of ocean from Midway to Tokyo would now be fought over on America's terms. In Tokyo, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto received the final confirmation. 4 fleet carriers lost, thousands of men gone. Reconnaissance had failed. Code security had been compromised. Every assumption that shaped Japan's Pacific strategy had crumbled. Yamamoto had warned against a prolonged war with the United States. Now he saw clearly how right he had been. He turned to his staff and spoke words that would never be forgotten. "The war is over. We will fight on, but the war is over." The psychological impact within the Japanese command was profound. For a military that had built itself on pride, discipline, and precision, the Midway disaster revealed fatal flaws. They had underestimated the American industrial engine, ignored the warnings of intelligence vulnerability, and placed too much faith in a perfect strike. Midway shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. For the Americans, Midway was more than strategy. It was validation. Everything that had gone wrong at Pearl Harbor, lack of preparation, intelligence failures, tactical errors, had been reversed. The decisions that led to victory were human ones. Spruance's bold call to launch early, McClusky's decision to follow a lone destroyer, Best's instinct to switch targets mid-dive. They were not flawless moves, but they were the right ones at the right time. Midway proved that modern war belonged to those who could adapt. The Americans had fought with incomplete information, outdated planes, and green pilots, but with superior code-breaking, teamwork, and determination. The Japanese had more experience, better aircraft, and tactical brilliance, but no margin for error. And at Midway, every error was magnified. As the smoke cleared and both sides withdrew, the Pacific remained as vast and unforgiving as ever. But beneath its waves, it held the wreckage of a shattered strategy and the seeds of what would become an unstoppable American counteroffensive. Midway was not the end. It was the end of the beginning. In Part 15, we conclude with a reflection on the enduring meaning of Midway, the cost of hubris, the power of resolve, and the lessons those 11 minutes still teach us today. Stay with us as we close this chapter in the voice of history itself. The Battle of Midway lasted days, but history was rewritten in 11 minutes. From 10:20 to 10:31 a.m. on June 4, 1942, the trajectory of World War II and of the modern world pivoted. 3 Japanese carriers were turned into burning tombs, and the myth of Imperial invincibility was shattered. But Midway was never just about steel, smoke, and strategy. It was about people, young men in cramped cockpits, navigating endless ocean skies with little more than a compass and instinct. Mechanics sweating below decks, risking everything to rearm planes in record time. Commanders making decisions that would be judged for generations, some rightly, some never fairly. and families thousands of miles away who never knew the full story of why their sons didn't come home. What Midway revealed, more than any technical lesson, was the truth about war in the modern age. That information, knowing more sooner and acting faster, matters more than might. That courage is not the absence of fear, but pressing forward when the odds are stacked against you. That the future belongs not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. The Japanese Navy entered Midway, believing it was writing the final chapter of the war in the Pacific. Instead, it opened a new volume, one where America would take the offensive, island by island, sea by sea. The battle's aftermath saw a relentless American advance, powered by unmatched industry, innovation, and a generation of fighters galvanized by sacrifice. By 1945, Tokyo would burn, and carriers like those lost at Midway would dominate every ocean. And yet, even in victory, Midway left scars. The American pilots who returned lived with what they saw. The Japanese survivors bore shame they couldn't speak of. Wreckage lies today in the cold deep, silent witnesses to those minutes when the fate of nations turned. Every twisted bulkhead, every rusted wing tells a story of decisions made in urgency, bravery, and sometimes error. There were no guarantees, only moments and men who seized them. Midway's legacy is not one of glorifying war. It's a warning, a lesson in the price of overconfidence, the importance of preparation, and the power of systems over myth. Admiral Nagumo said it best before his death. At Midway, we learned that wars are not won by warriors, but by systems. Today, over the place where Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, and Yorktown rest, the Pacific is calm. The surface gives no hint of what happened below. But for those who remember, for those who study history not as a list of battles, but as a mirror of humanity, Midway is a reminder of how fragile power is, how costly miscalculation becomes, and how decisive the actions of a few can be. So the next time you look at the ocean, think of those 11 minutes, of smoke trails and falling bombs, of courage, failure, and the weight of command. And remember that in war, as in life, it's often not the biggest weapon, but the smallest decision that makes history. If this story moved you, please like the video, subscribe to our channel for more historical deep dives, and share your thoughts in the comments. What lessons do you take from Midway? We'd love to hear your reflections.